Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show, producing this episode from the road. I'm about to be camping, so I'm doing it from the car studio, and as always, the Zoom 6 is a road warrior of a device. If you're ever going to get into podcasting, I say start with Zoom and work your way from there. Either way, let's talk about our friend who usually joins us, once a quarter or so. That's Will Reilly. Comes on to talk about maybe the most talked about book out there right now. There's a lady named Robin DiAngelo, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and she wrote a book called White Fragility, and it has caused quite the stir, and that's why it's the most talked about book out there. So the magazine commentarymagazine.com has asked Will to write a review of the paper from his PhD point of view, and all of those elements come together, and we discuss just what this book is about, what it means to be white, defining blackness, and just talking about, look, here's the thing. When you get into social problems, you've heard me say this a lot, these are multivariate problems. And when you start to look at what variables impact how race or how performance happens, you realize that things like having two parents at home, or making $10,000 more a year, or the amount of words that are read to you when you're a baby, these are the things that close the gap, where it makes race largely irrelevant, largely, of course. But anyhow, we're going to get into this whole conversation, and it actually goes on quite a long time, and we could have done it again and talked about the entire thing in a new direction, because we don't care about fragility. We care about having candid, hard conversations about things, and I hope you guys can appreciate that. I know that most of you do, and if you do love the show, 5 episodes a week. Even when I'm on the road, we're putting them up. We're getting a lot of live episodes. If you see a live episode that you like, there will always be a podcast version of it. Not every podcast version has a live associated episode, but for the most part, every episode is now recorded live first. You can always get that on the YouTube channel, which you can always find in the show notes, or you can just go to breakitdownshow.com or Apple Podcasts or Google Play or all the sites, wherever you're at. Throw a 5-star review, subscribe, throw a rating. These things help. Also, if you're going to sign up for Audible, if you're going to buy the books, use the links that we provide, because these things help keep money coming in the door. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So that always helps us to get things going. One more thing to say to you. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. Click on the donate tab. Just put a little small amount of money in. Maybe a one-time donation of $50. Or you can buy a raffle ticket for the Save the Brave rifle by going to blackstonearms.com. And you can bid on this $5,000 rifle. You buy a $100 ticket, maybe you get lucky. We're not going to sell that many tickets, so you got a pretty good chance. I would say less than 1 in 200. All right. Anyhow, enough about all that stuff. Here comes our friend, Dr. Wilfred Reilly.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Dr. Wilfred Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
The Chill Vibe Scribe from Twitter has already asked what kind of doctor you are, and then I said that you were a political scientist, but you're also an author, and you've written a bunch of great books, and recently, and I like this as much as you do, you were called the R-rated Thomas Sowell. So congratulations on being linked to a legend and being R-rated, which is fine.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. That was just some guy on Twitter, honestly. But yeah, in terms of what kind of doctor I am, I mean the non-useful kind. I did well enough in business. I funded grad school at that time, and I ended up with a PhD in political science. And I think that, the questions we ask, how can the great races get along? How can we avoid war? Those are useful. But if someone says, I'm about to give birth on a train, there's not much I can do. Maybe tell them about poverty or something like that. So I am an academic doctor. And in general, people with that title don't insist on being referred to as doctor and so on outside of a conference. But I do have the PhD.
Yes. And I guess we should get to the business at hand. You read and reviewed, and I don't know if the review is posted or not yet, but you read and reviewed White Fragility. And I think this will be interesting, brushed up against your Taboo book that you wrote last year. So I guess give us the basics and tell us where we can find the review too, if it's up and once it's up.
Well, the review should be up in a couple days in Commentary magazine.
Okay.
Kind of very well known center right, traditionally targeted at Jewish Americans review, although obviously pretty broad audience these days. And it's an analysis of white fragility. I actually went in with a pretty open mind. But yeah, I wrote the book Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About, which looks at a lot of the taboo issues around race relations in the USA. I have a chapter critiquing the alt-right. I have a chapter where I look at whether the statistics behind the Black Lives Matter movement are accurate. And bluntly, they aren't. The total number of unarmed Black people killed by police last year was 15, and that's pretty typical. So we've seen the country on the fringe of some pretty extreme violence because of what is not really mathematically kind of a sweeping episodic problem. I look at interracial crime in general in another chapter, and I do find some interesting things. There's an unusual amount of interracial crime against Asians. Interracial crime is actually more Black on white than white on Black. But overall, again, the total percentage of crime that is interracial violent crime is around 5%. So I make that point. The person most likely to kill you is your husband or wife. So, I mean, I just discuss how accurate some of these fears are of kind of enemy male warriors, of white supremacy, of some of this other stuff. And because of that, I was contacted by John Podhoretz over at Commentary, and he said, well, White Fragility just hit #1 on the bestseller list. We'd like to have someone review it, preferably an academic. Would you be interested in reviewing it? And I thought it seemed entertaining. So I said, yeah, got a copy of the book and read it. And I mean, I have some issues with the book, I will say. It's well written, but I think there's a lot in there that's almost nonsensical from a social science standpoint.
And the site is commentarymagazine.com. Is that where the review is?
Commentary is a pretty well-known magazine. So yeah, I think they'd have the rights to comment. Let's look that up, actually. Commentary magazine.
Because there is a Commentary magazine. It says conservative Jewish thought and opinion, but I don't want to put that up if it's not the right thing. Not that we're not talking about
commentary. Yeah, it's commentarymagazine.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
A Jewish magazine of politics, high culture, cultural and literary criticism, American and Israeli campaigns and elections. Yeah, so they own that trademark to commentarymagazine.com, or that site, that URL.
Right. And then what about the credentials for the author of White Fragility? What was her background?
Well, DiAngelo, as I understand, has a PhD in sociology, and she's one of the people that kind of pioneered that field of corporate diversity consulting, where you can have someone go to your business and tell you that you're a little bit racist and give some advice on how to have people get along better, and then collect a check for $20,000. She really, with her White Fragility presentations, was one of the first people to open up that field. You'd also have to give a shout out to Ibram Kendi, who also wrote a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But DiAngelo is both an academic and kind of a professional woke person, or a professional anti-racist. She still does business consulting. She's worked with a lot of the Fortune 500. Apparently, she's a very pleasant person, very approachable and so on. But she will go in and tell white people that they are part of this system of hidden implicit prejudice for money.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got to make your money somehow. And I don't like to mess with people's money very much, but I am interested in what you thought. Before we dive fully into that, though, when you talk about violence against Asians, how do you, this is just a Pete question, but, and when you talk about Asians, I instantly like to bring up Asia Minor is a place, it's part of Asia. So how do you wash out the violence that would be maybe anti-Islamic versus, violence against someone from Southeast Asia instead?
Well, I think the simple answer is that for purposes of the U.S. Census, and presumably the one time I looked at this for the BJS, the U.S. National Crime Report, Arab Muslims are considered Caucasians. So they would just fall in the Caucasian category. This whole thing with race, what does it mean, is actually a fascinating conversation, and really having it invalidates a lot of the points that the hard alt-right tries to make, and also that the social justice left tries to make. So, for example, I mean, what we think of as white people, Western European Caucasians, are only one subset of what's actually a pretty large Caucasian group around the world that includes people in the quote unquote stans, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, so on. That includes people in the Arab Muslim world, Iran, Iraq. Well, Iran, of course, is Persian, but Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. That includes Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, all of that. I mean, all those are Caucasian countries, even if we don't necessarily think of those people as white. And there's maybe a 1 or 2% level of genetic variance among Caucasian. So if you actually were a white supremacist, you would have to explain to me why Iraq isn't one of the world's leading societies. That's a 100% Caucasian society. You can't just point at Norway and say, look at this small, rich country. I mean, as a black guy, I could do the same thing with Bermuda or Botswana or something like that. Like, look at this wonderful place. But then someone would be perfectly justified in coming back and saying, well, what about South Sudan? So, I mean, these racial questions are fascinating. I mean, there's a very large African descent group, a very large Caucasian group. But, I mean, even though it's a highly intelligent question, it doesn't really apply here because we just lump Arabs into the white category. And again, with the crime report, that does bring up some questions. I mean, if you say that there's, not a lot of crime against whites, I mean, how much of that is directed against Europeans, Hispanics in some cases, and so on down the line. But I mean, the Asians thing, I mean, we are talking mostly about East Asians, and that was just interesting because normally interracial crime is pretty rare. Like tough, quote unquote, brothers and rednecks generally don't cross neighborhood lines to attack one another. There's no reason to do that. So if you look at interracial crime, like, as I recall, 12% of all crime against blacks was committed by whites, and 15% of all crime against whites was committed by blacks. And by the way, black people make up 14% of the population. So, I mean, I get that 15 is larger than 14, or, the black rate of interracial crime is higher than the white rate of interracial crime and so on. But the reality of interracial crime is that even for the white population, black people make up 15% of the country and commit 15% of the crimes. Like, this normally is not a huge deal. Asians were the exception, though, maybe because they're a small population, maybe because they're seen as defenseless. But, I mean, if you look at crime against Asians, it was like 25% white, 27% black, 24% Hispanic, and then like 20% Asian. So, I mean, that was very bizarre. I mean, everyone seems to pick on Asians, whether that's tough white guys or that's black, perhaps street criminals or something like that. But yeah, that's just a side note from some of my writing about race. I'm sure it's more than a side note to the Asian American community, but that is something you find if you look at what's called the BJS, the Bureau of Justice Statistics Annual Crime Data Report.
But this is part of the problem of the conversation is the person having it wants to define what white is on their terms, and they reject the academic terms because they're part of the patriarchy or whatever it is. And, I've been told that Greek people aren't white. Okay. I've put up a picture of Assad's father who used to run Syria. And you look at that man and you say, that looks like a white guy. But here's a guy from Syria who's not white. I've had a black guy. I mean, as dark as can be, black guy from Turkey tell me he was white. I've had people from Trinidad say, I'm not black. I'm from Trinidad. So all of these things, it can become confounding. And I promise, if you and I were sitting in a bar in Tbilisi and I said, oh, I'm Caucasian, I'm from the Caucasus region, they would laugh at me. I'm not, so all of this stuff really is a lot of mumbo jumbo. And when we're really trying to figure this stuff out, we can't even agree on terms, and it becomes a little bit ridiculous, which I guess brings me back to the book of White Fragility. Someone suggested that I read it, but I don't need to read a book to have it call me racist, because it seems to me that when you bring race into a conversation that's a multivariate social conversation, it rots out the logic. Not that there aren't racial problems and divides between, prejudices, but we tend to lose track. It becomes taboo, right? Like if someone calls me in social media a racist, I have to stop talking, because there's no point in continuing that conversation, because there's nothing I can say at that point. I've been tagged a racist. Whether I am one or not, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of that, first of all, I will say I debate a lot semi-formally, and I follow the old debaters' rules. I mean, one of them is that the person who advances a thesis has to prove it. Mm-hmm. So for me, I get that too, possibly because I'm light-skinned, but I don't even respond by saying, no, I'm not. Like, I mean, well-known anti-racist writer. No, I'm not. I'm a black guy. I just say, prove it. Yeah. Like, prove I'm a racist. Yeah. Like, what in this conversation is actually demonstrably racist? What implies that I don't like whites or blacks or whatever the case might be? And no one can ever do it. They generally just say something like, well, I won't do your intellectual labor for you, which is my all-time favorite woke internet dodge. Mm-hmm. Or, well, if you don't know, you probably never will. Or my favorite, if you were black, you'd understand. And sometimes then I will be like, I am black. I'm Wilfred Reilly. Google me. And then the conversation shifts and they're like, oh, you're kind of conservative, but like you're known for arguing with the alt-right. Okay, you're not racist. But nothing that I've said has changed. Racist is just a label that's used to insult anyone with a necktie on you think you might not like.
Yeah.
Any white guy, often any male. It doesn't inherently mean anything in a lot of circumstances. Now, of course, racist does have, no, well, actually, this swings directly into the book.
Yeah.
So White Fragility is Robin DiAngelo's famous book where she does two things. One, along with Peggy McIntosh and Ibram Kendi, she really defines this idea or polishes this idea of systemic institutional racism. And the second is that she argues because of systemic institutional racism, whites aren't used to being criticized on the basis of race. And as someone who spends time on the internet, I found the second claim so amazing and surprising that I went back and read that chapter again. But that is basically what she says. So there are two components of this. First, she says that society is in every possible way subtly structured to benefit white people. And we'll get into what that means. But what racism traditionally has had a pretty clear meaning. It is disliking people just because of their membership in a racial group. So if you looked over at a bunch of Hispanics and were like, damn Mexicans, I hate them, you would be a racist. That's pretty much it. That's the definition of racism. What DiAngelo and other scholars have done is say, essentially, there must be a subtler form of racism scattered throughout society because there are performance gaps between groups. And I'm being a bit simplistic here, but that's essentially the argument. So DiAngelo at one point says, there are differences in performance in virtually every field of society between whites and POC that usually advantage whites, although not always. And this is evidence of racism. And a lot of people in the systemic racism school will argue that you can be either an anti-racist or a racist, and that's it. So Ibram Kendi has said that if you look at differences between whites and blacks in terms of arrest rate, for example, you can believe either A, blacks are inferior, pathological, and violent, or B, there's something in the system at every level, the level of arrest, charging, so on, that is racially discriminatory against black people. And I personally feel this is a nonsensical idea. I think that there's a third option, C, which is that different groups perform differently all the time because of cultural and situational and national variables that aren't genetic at all. So, I mean, we can very easily, just to do an analysis, thinking back to DiAngelo, I mean, for example, in one sentence, the problem with systemic racism is that if you adjust for variables other than race, most of the gaps that the people who talk about systemic racism bring up vanish almost totally. And this becomes apparent if you extend your analysis beyond just black people and white people to, say, Asians or Jews, who take, in many cases, as much prejudice as blacks, certainly more than whites, but who outperform both groups. That debunks the entire theory unless you somehow think the USA was set up to systemically advantage Koreans. So, I mean, just like to give an example of how the cultural variables work, this is the one I usually use when I speak, but the average working black guy makes, in terms of what's called personal income, so we don't get into households or complications or, are women marrying these days or whatever, just personal income for males. The average black guy makes about 80%, 85% of what the average white guy does. This has been attributed by woke scold types to racism basically forever, going back to the 1970s. But a while ago, when the gap was bigger than it is now, two people, the government economist June O'Neill and the conservative researcher, who at the time was pretty nonpartisan, Dinesh D'Souza, actually took a look at this income data using what are called GAO, Government Accounting Office, figures for the population. And they found that the gap almost goes away if you adjust for just a few things. Like one was age, which doesn't have anything to do with race or racism whatsoever. It's a purely situational, cultural variable. But because black families have more kids, so do Hispanic families, Eastern European families, the most common age for a black guy is 27. The most common age for a white guy is 58. You can Google that just by going to Pew average age different races. It's a pretty non-contested fact. But that drives down black incomes. You're not going to be a senior executive or a military officer beyond maybe first bar lieutenant at 27, 25. So that's one of them. Another variable was residency. So like blacks and whites both make less in the South, and they make fairly similar incomes if you're looking at like Mississippi or Arkansas. but there are more black people that live in the South. I don't want to be glib, I'm pro-black, but that's kind of where the boats landed. I mean, like the slave trade was conducted with the southern ports, like New Orleans and Charleston. So when we got off, when these captured warriors got off the boat, they were in the South. So today, the South has a lot more black people. They don't make dramatically less than whites in the South, but wages are lower in the South. You have to adjust for region. Another thing was just number of years, not quality, which is a class thing that could reflect racism in the past, but just number of years of education. Did you trust the educational system and stay in school? That was the third. And the fourth was any standardized test score. Like, what's your tested IQ on the math portion? If you adjust for just those four things, the gap that's attributed to some kind of sneaky racism out there in the system goes away totally. So my comment is that what we're seeing when we see group performance differences isn't some kind of hidden racism you need a genius consultant to track down. It's easily measurable differences between the groups in things like tested math ability. Like, that's really wonky, but it's accurate. And again, we see this when you just look at, for example, Asians. One of the things that someone once bet me like $50 I couldn't win a debate with the alt-right and the social justice movement in an image. And I actually thought about it for a while, and then I pulled up the US income figures and just sent it to them. And they were like, okay, you know, I don't know whether cash changed hands or not, but it was sort of like, okay, this kind of does it. Number one was Indian Americans. Number two, I think, was Nigerians, Japanese Americans, Filipinos. Like, there was no way, either as a genetic bigot or as a social justice whiner, you could explain the presence of Arabs or West Africans or whatever in that number two spot, or Indians in that number one spot. So if you just move to groups that do better than whites on those variables, like how long do you wait to have a kid, how many degrees do you have, those groups predictably also do better than whites financially. You can see a slight effect of bigotry. Asians make like 2% less than you would expect them to do because they're a coastal population. But in general, Asians are kicking everyone's ass when it comes to income and educational test scores. So that, to me, is the rebuttal to systemic racism. Like, only a fool would deny that bigotry in the past has harmed blacks, or for that matter, Boston Irishmen or Native Americans or something like that. But there's a difference between saying we may be more likely to start out with a young single mom because of incidents in the past. On the one hand, maybe that could be true. There's a difference between that and saying, on the other hand, a black guy will be treated dramatically differently from an equally qualified white guy. That was true in 1954. That's not true today. If I were to go back into the business world and apply for jobs on major trading floors, I would be hired overnight. I don't think I'd be treated any differently from a white guy, but if I was, I might have a slight advantage. Because, I mean, there's still, black people are 13% of the population, or only 9% of that field, as I recall. So a boss who has his eye on the company diversity goals might prefer to have me in there. But the gap that you see when you look at the treatment of young black people is not race itself, it's characteristics associated with that. And when you adjust for those characteristics like poverty and test scores, most of the gap goes away. There still, of course, are some hardcore racists. But that's systemic racism, and that's my response to it. What DiAngelo does, a quick overview here, but I mean, is argue that because of this systemic racism, which is constantly advantaging white people behind the scenes, white people are never challenged about their race. So she argues that black people, for example, will find themselves not represented in movies. They might be portrayed as criminals. You might be harassed by a cop. On the other hand, as a white person, you are treated better most of the time. You're rarely just accused of racism for being white, for example. And what I find as an internet kid who grew up in a big city is that for at least the past 20 years, that hasn't really been true either. If you just Google something like white people are the problem, you'll find these incredible articles from major periodicals. BuzzFeed recently had a dead serious piece, goes on for about 15 pages, but it was called The 37 Things White People Need to Stop Ruining This Year. And it included like everything imaginable, like macaroni and cheese, sex, dogs, protest marches. So, I mean, I don't think that the key points of this really hold together that well. I don't think there is an invisible racism that exists once you've adjusted for everything else. And I don't think that white people are left out of that very aggressive Twitter conversation anymore if they ever were. So I say that in the review. And I also mentioned some good things about the book. It's well written, it's coherent. But I think that trying to find this hidden racism within yourself as so many well-intentioned white people are trying to do, probably isn't going to do all that much for black people. What would really help out black people is boosting those math test scores or getting a few more cops in the hood, or very specific things that as a local mayor, I'm going to encourage people to get done. But you finding the last vestige of prejudice inside yourself is a bit silly. And some of the examples given in the woke literature, I'm not specifically blaming DiAngelo here, but I mean, border on the absurd. Like when I have sex with my black boyfriend, I wonder if I enjoy it because I'm fetishizing him. It's literally the least racist people imaginable asking, is there one remaining core element of prejudice to me? And I don't think that's what's going to stop murders in the hood, be that hood black or poor white.
When I think about the narrative of black people being shot, by cops, I struggle with that because, as you said, the numbers aren't there. And also, if there's a problem with violence of the police against people, I think if you just started with our poor people shot by the cops more often in use of force, deaths, I think that would be a bigger problem, a more inclusive problem. People that just today, later on, we're going to release our podcast version of our conversation with Bjorn Lomborg. And he's like, yeah, there's a problem with the climate, the problem with the environment. And if we spend money on getting people out of poverty, that problem will be, it's much more powerful in terms of actually helping people survive, whatever happens 80 years from now. But we hate that conversation. But this is the reality is when you don't have enough money, there are trapdoors all around you. Like I drove around for a long time with dead tags because I had a $1,200 problem, but I didn't have $1,200, and there was no way I was going to have it. And so, my opportunities to get into a negative encounter with the police. And at one point they were going to tow my car. And I said to the lady, I'm in Balboa Island in San Diego with my daughter. There's no way we're going to get home if you do this. And the lady was kind and said, okay, we won't tow your car, get your registration fixed. But those are that's poor people problems. And then you get to the point where you're just like, F it. It doesn't matter what I do. And then maybe you take a big jump at something, or maybe you run into the cops and do suicide by cop. Poverty seems to be a much bigger problem than race. Is that fair to think that, you think, or no?
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
Than race. Is that fair to think that, you think, or no?
I think that that's been true in every society throughout history since the first priest lied to the first king. Or, it's, who knows if they're lying? I'm not the most spiritual guy, but people believe things. But I think that in general, that is almost always true. And I'll go a step further and get almost conspiratorial. I think that the leaders of elite entities like our political parties very often use things like race, which in the American context doesn't necessarily exist. Hispanics are almost invariably Caucasian. They're not classified as white, which is, again, one of those things that just totally scuttlebutts the alt-right and the social justice movement. Why is this group of working class Caucasians posting these figures at this level? How can you explain that using either of your methodologies? But I'll get off my hobby horse, which is yelling at those two movements. Basically, I definitely do feel that the leaders of elite organizations prefer that the working class not be unified against them. And tools like race, religion in the past, so on, are very, very often used to create that disunity. Throughout much of American history, it's a simple fact that the living conditions for an Irishman or an Italian weren't any better than the living conditions for a Black American. What they were told was this sort of lie, at least I'm a white man. And we see the same thing today from the two parties. Do you want to unite with them? Those are the racists versus, well, that party won't accept you. You're an individual of color. In general, the most obvious form of oppression is class, i.e. how much money you have, how able you are to feed your young daughter. That's oppression. If you can't feed your kid, you're oppressed. I would say that the only effect other variables have is that they increase your likelihood of experiencing class oppression. So even today, you probably are slightly more likely to be in the lower class as a black guy than a white guy once you adjust for the 5 primary variables that might bear on that. There's a history of past racism there. But the effect of the race prejudice, if that makes sense, is a class effect. It reduces your ability to function in social class terms. The same thing with sexism. The things that feminists talk about in general, like the glass ceiling, if you're talking to an intelligent second wave feminist, relate directly to business opportunities. Prejudice in general is used to prevent you from climbing the social class ladder. And in countries that actually have explicit family or race-based caste systems, you really, really see this. Like, some people are the nobles. And if you look at ideas like blue blood, they're mostly related. They mostly look alike. Those people own vast tracts of land, and you don't, commoner. I mean, so that's the foundation of the modern system of oppression, the class and caste and guild systems that we had for thousands of years. So a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, I think class is the primary form of oppression. And I will say, I mean, I've been Poe, to quote one of my favorite rap songs. I mean, yeah, it's very expensive to be poor. I mean, if you do something like re-up your ID on time and you have your old ID with you in Kentucky, that's $7. If you've lost your ID or your ID is from another state or your ID's been expired for a year, you've just been going to one liquor store, it's going to be 4 or 5 times that. I went to the bodega the last time I was back in the hood in Illinois, and I was surprised to see that a sausage was $6.98. No, it's a delicious sausage. It's homemade chorizo and so on. But again, there's a very high overhead in these places because of theft. There's a very high overhead because of spoilage. So when I go down to Kroger, I buy a sausage for $1.98. If you're a guy who's only making $400 a week or $300 a week, your breakfast is going to cost $8 because you don't have the money or the time to travel across town and go to the supermarket. So yeah, I mean, poverty is an enormous pain in the ass. Poverty is the primary form of oppression. One of my issues with the idea of white privilege, actually, is that it doesn't really take into account the fact that the majority of poor people in the USA are white. So it's one thing to say that relative to an equally qualified black guy, you might have a few points of privilege as a white person. That may even still be true. But it's another thing altogether to go to some out-of-work coal miner and say, you don't understand how lucky you were to be born with this skin color. And we recently saw Oprah Winfrey do this. I mean, Oprah is the 49th richest woman in the world. She's worth $2.59 billion.
Yeah.
And she gave this impassioned speech about how the USA has a racial and regional caste system that you really can't rise through. And there's something astonishingly surreal about this black Southern multimillionaire saying this. Like, I don't mean to be glib, but why don't you hire other black Southern people? Like, you're worth $3 billion.
Yeah.
That's what, 1,000 $3 million a year jobs. I mean, like you would have the ability at that level where you own O Magazine to bring a good chunk of the black community out of poverty yourself. So, I mean, I do think that sometimes we get lost in these fantastic tangles of logic and we wind up in these weird places where Oprah says she's oppressed. Oprah actually has done that a few times. I remember once in Italy, I think she was not able to get into the Bulgari store because it was closing. And she mentioned this as an example of racism when someone asked her about it on TV. And it became sort of an embarrassing conversation because, I mean, people were saying, well, the Germans and even the Northern Italians are legendarily punctual. They close the doors at these times. And, I've never been to the Bulgari store in my life. What's it like? Your claim is that you're experiencing prejudice because they shut the doors on you so you couldn't buy a $10,000 handbag. And I mean, I do think that all too often that perspective is taken too seriously. You'll see working class whites say things like, well, I don't understand what that would feel like. I mean, I understand what it would feel like. It would feel like you had enough money to buy a $10,000 handbag and you got there 5 minutes late. Go back tomorrow. I mean, I have a lot more sympathy for the coal miner, the guy's getting shot at, on Iraq's frozen plain or whatever.
Yeah. So, yes, exactly. Like, okay, just buy it on Amazon. It'll just show up at your house. I'm sure
go back to your 5-star hotel and buy it on your phone.
Get your concierge. Yeah.
The thing is, like, I've experienced racism myself. I've encountered racism in my life. I mean, just to give 2 examples of what modern racism looks like. When I was a canvas manager in Chicago, I had a team of guys that I would take out into the street as a college boy to raise money for whatever cause, like Ducks Unlimited, a gay rights bill, one summer, we're those kids out there like, hey, got a minute for whatever? And I did notice people were 10 or 15% less likely to give money to black canvassers. Now, that might be because a lot of street side hustlers in Chicago happen to be black. But nonetheless, I mean, let's not make excuses. That affected guys who were street salesmen who were African American. That's a form of racism I've seen. You are making less money than an equally qualified white guy because of this variable. This one goes both ways, but when I was in the nightlife promotion business, again in college, because I don't like the taste of ramen, I've had jobs since I was about 15. But I mean, I had clubs openly tell me, and I won't name them, but like, we don't want you to bring in people of this background. Fairly often it was African Americans. A lot of black clubs didn't want whites. Ironically, almost no clubs wanted soldiers and sailors because they always get into fights. Like none of them did. But I mean, so, and generally if a club got too detailed and racist with this, like we don't want American troops, we don't want black people, we don't want Italians, I would just end that business relationship. I don't like racist. But that's an example of racism I've seen. It's going to be, again, 10 or 15% more difficult if you're black or, for that matter, an ethnic white guy to get into some upper-end nightclubs. But, I mean, I do think when people say, I can't even understand that experience, yeah, you can. You can understand what it would feel like to be 20% less likely to get into an upper-end club. Like, we're no longer talking about the great racists fighting in the streets with weapons. So, I mean, I think in practice, if you're attempting to measure privilege, and I've done this, actually, just as a little test in my classrooms and so on. But I mean, if you ask people to fill out a 100-item questionnaire full of things that say how easy your life has been. I know what frequent flyer miles are. I've had an unpaid internship. I've never lost a physical fight, 100 of them. You find that race does have a 2 or 3 point impact on your score. So yeah, whites have it a little bit easier. What has a 40-point impact on your score is social class. 30 to 40-point impact every time. How rich your dad is or your mom. I mean, that is what for young people predicts how easy your life has been. Like if you're living in a car, it doesn't really matter that you're living in a car and you're white.
No.
And I mean, there are a bunch of other things like this, like being gay.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is a Southern historically black college. Like if you are a flamboyantly gay man, you're probably going to have some trouble if you're, for example, an athlete or something like that. I'm not at all saying we tolerate that environment, but it would be easier for you if you were straight. I mean, like it's silly to deny that all these things, being Jewish, if you think about being part of, say, a men's athletic team and you fully wear the kippah and all of that, there are a lot of things that are going to affect how you're treated in life. So narrowing this down to this one idea of traditional whiteness, I mean, sure, that's a part of it. That's a 17th of it, but that's not really the full debate.
What is the deal with the graphic where I've seen her break down racist ideas such as keeping a schedule? One of the things I like to say is I believe in immigrants. I believe in black people. Don't tell me for 1 second that the rest of the world sailed around the ocean, and then the black folks are like, I don't know what to do. Like we only have a stick. I mean, come the fuck on. Of course, maybe there's no record of it because it's prehistoric, but don't tell me that people didn't sail from Africa over to South America or Africa to the Caribbean because the ocean begs you to do it. It just begs it. So what is it about this idea about schedules and hard work? There's no way that hard work is some kind of universal white value. There's no way that that's true.
Well, that's an excellent question. So first of all, now I will say technically, except for Mansa Musa's soldiers, I don't necessarily think any West Africans got here. I mean, the currents on that trip would be pretty difficult to get around. The Ethiopians may have. But I mean, the broad comment, first of all, this is another one of these things where you can discuss whether there have been small but real differences in kind of the level of civilization of different races and so on throughout history. That's a real conversation. I mean, there certainly are today. I'd rather live in Germany than Afghanistan. Although actually that's the same race. Interesting. Caucasians. But anyway, but look, but I mean, so like it's valid to say, I don't think the West Africans accomplished quite as much as Europeans did with a similar resource base or something. But when people, overall, I'm agreeing with you. When people say, well, there weren't any significant empires in Africa, that's absolutely nonsensical. I mean, there was Ghana, Songhai, Mansa Musa's Mali, Ethiopia, which is a fairly powerful country today, so on down the line. And we're just talking about, civilized nations with ambassadors and so on. I mean, if you go to just powerful warlords, I mean, you'd have to put in Shaka and Dingane and all those guys that almost defeated modern South Africa. So yeah, there's a great history in Africa. I just don't know if they got here. The boats weren't built very well around the upper Mediterranean. They were built for Mediterranean sail conditions. West Africans adopted that type of boat, as I understand, that type of ship. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. There's some interesting Olmec hid evidence and all that. But yeah, I mean, your broader point, though, is absolutely accurate. And I think I'll get into why DiAngelo says this. But what we're seeing right now is this really, really odd idea that success is whiteness. So you'll see, and I've done this because, I mean, I'm an executive, technically speaking. I'm our faculty ombudsman at a good university as well as one of our professors. And in things like executive training or diversity training seminars, people openly say this, like, well, being precisely on time has generally been thought of as a white characteristic, or using proper grammar has generally been thought of as a white characteristic. And I will say that for myself and the other guys that I've seen in exec meetings at a good black school, I mean, people have kind of taken their staff aside afterward and said, look, you know, take that for what it is, but you still have to be here at, 7:59 tomorrow. Like, we're not going to adopt a, traditionally African style of, punctuality or whatever. But yeah, this idea has recently become pretty prevalent. I think it's a very racist idea. I'm pretty sure that Genghis Khan or Mansa Musa expected their generals to be up sharing maps with them at the crack of dawn. I don't think that there was the idea that if you were defeated in battle, that's okay, because focusing on success is a white thing. In terms of why, we lost the third Khanate, but that's all right.
No big deal.
I mean, there tends to be this idea among white liberals, and I think to some extent it is a projection of sexual fantasies, actually, among a lot of these young party kids. But there tends to be this idea that if minorities ran things, we'd spend all day dancing and making love. That, Nigerians or Japanese people or whatnot historically weren't, clock punching warriors, but were instead relaxed, beautiful people that just spent all day laying under coconut trees, waiting for nature's bounty to fall on us. And I think if you're a young person, I found this specifically with party girls, not to stereotype, but if you're a young person who's highly intelligent, that kind of sounds like heaven. Like, why should I do anything but fight and have sex? Why would I? I want to sit around all day. I don't want to go to these boring meetings. So it's very easy to project that onto another culture and say, well, that's what they did in Samoa. And this actually goes back to like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and all these people, where they would go to these societies and they were essentially tourists, and they would party with their friends who were a cool mix of upper class minority kids. And then they would come back home and say, everyone has this relaxed, wonderful attitude towards sex, and they were drinking the last 6 hours of the day and so on. And later, ordinary working class people from those societies came to college here and were like, nope, that's not what it was like at all. This was somebody on a 2-week vacation.
Yes.
This is absolutely idiotic. So anyway, this is this fantasy that's existed among the white upper class for a while. It's not based, as far as I can tell, in any reality. If you actually look at Japanese or Nigerian or South African or Brazilian business culture, they're there at 8 o'clock in the morning eating donuts and churros, doing the planning meeting just like everybody else. I mean, the Japanese army did a good job of fighting us for a country a third our size. That's just nonsense. The reason that it's becoming more prevalent, though, I will say, I think is this idea of systemic racism, which again involves a redefinition of the concept of racism. So traditionally, the concept of racism has been extraordinarily, extraordinarily simple. If you dislike other people because of their race, you're a racist. And with the Robin DiAngelo's and the Ibram Kendis and the Peggy McIntoshes, we started seeing that shift a little bit, where people start saying racism actually is a system. The only reason there can be performance gaps between groups is prejudice. So any system that produces performance gaps must be racist. And because of that, the new generation of wokies is categorizing far more things as prejudice than ever before. Because when you look at systems that produce performance gaps, I mean, they do include kind of traditional time-focused business. They do include things like the SAT test. I mean, they do include things like the system of policing. So if you define racism as not meaning people who hate blacks or Mexicans or Irishmen or whatever, but instead as people who compete in systems that produce gaps, it becomes very, very easy for you to define things as racist. So in White Fragility, DiAngelo doesn't just say, well, I think being punctual is a little racist. She also defines meritocracy as racist, the belief that people succeed based on their abilities. She defines a belief in capitalism as racist, because you're allowing this brutal racial competition if you're allowing capitalism. She defines individualism as racist because if you think people are treated as individuals rather than members of groups, you're disadvantaging the groups on the lower end of that performance scale. So this is actually dangerous stuff, although I'm sure DiAngelo or McIntosh would be a wonderful dinner guest if you paid them. But I mean, like, this is actually dangerous stuff because what people are doing when they say these things, they rarely draw the implications themselves, of course. These are social scientists. But the logical implication of this from a political or military standpoint is that we have to destroy our society in order to be good. If things like individualism, meritocracy, and work are bad, what's good? Well, apparently a sort of laid-back, racially integrated communism. So things like socialist medicine and extreme affirmative action would be sort of morally mandatory in this world. And a lot of these people are now beginning to say they are. If you read the platform of the Movement for Black Lives, by the way, I think it's absolutely Tomo Bedlam insane. But it says this. I mean, it says we need to get rid of all of the things that have contributed to this subtle systemic racism. So like all college would have to be free. All standardized tests would be done away with. And so on down the line. Like they attacked the nuclear family at one point. Like we want to dismantle the nuclear family in favor of like loving lesbian communes because some families produce different outcomes for kids than others do. So if you actually take this seriously, yeah, almost everything is racist. I guess my response to that would be to recommend against taking it seriously.
You know, when you think about places to go, lesbian communes on paper sounds great, but if you go to the Isle of Lesbos in Greece, there's just nothing there. It's you know, everybody left. It's not it's not what you want it to be. And the other thing I wanted to say is if Manu Musa says you better fucking be here when the sun's at the highest point in the sky, guess where you better be. You know, you don't just walk in and say black people time. No. It'll be people without a head time. You know, like when the boss says show up, you show up because the boss has things they're trying to do. The other thing it would actually be interesting to see modern woke people encounter Mansa Musa or Shaka Zulu or one of the Ethiopian emperors. It would be a matter of time before they were crucified. Yeah, absolutely.
Like the moment they started talking about the patriarchy and saying, why aren't there any women in this council? That'd probably be it. I mean, the king would call for a cross. You know, there's almost an attempt on the extreme woke left because the extreme woke left's focus to some extent is on our society as bad. There's almost an attempt to repaint or change all of the rest of history that you've probably noticed. I mean, if you read what high school students are assigned about the Aztec people today, I mean, they omit major things like the warfare and cannibalism so that it's basically just the bright colors and beautiful clothes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think a problem is that there actually are people that believe this. And I mean, when I was in school, this was starting to some extent. I remember at one point we were told that the Spanish brutally conquered the Aztec Empire. And one of my buddies who's Mexican raised his hand and said, how'd the Aztecs get the empire? Which covered like most of Mexico. And that led to this awkward explanation of, well, they had to take it from people too, but it was different because they were brown. But I mean, I think what was beginning then has now reached kind of a settled middle age now, that the wokeness is just accepted in a lot of the academy. It's accepted in a lot of the media, but it has a real impact. Yeah. Like if people have been taught since 16 that any performance difference between two groups has to be due to prejudice, then in practice, you must think everything from foot races to math tests is racist. And if you get to the point where you want to remove those things, you're going to have to dramatically reshape society. And again, my point would be that if you compare people with the same cultural background, I said this to the hard right and to the left, 80, 90, 100% of these differences just disappear. So my suggestion would be giving people, being culturalists to some extent rather than racist. There's nothing wrong with that. But giving poor white kids and black kids and so on the same amount of actual training in mathematics that Asian or better off kids get. You might still see something of a gap there, but the large problem would go away. And ignoring the large problem and saying, no, the issue is out there in the distance is some form of prejudice. And everyone, especially every Caucasian, needs to dig inside themselves and find anything they think could be wrong. That's just silly and self-flagellating. Like, that's not going to improve math test scores in the hood or anything else.
I always think about when you look at other countries around the world, it appears that we're the only racist place on earth, and we just know that's not true. But if you look up civil rights movement, you don't see a lot of other countries with the civil rights movement. If you look up America, the Disabilities Act, the ADA that we had, you don't see a lot of other countries with this kind of opportunity where you can literally have no eyes and make six figures. If you have cerebral palsy, go get a PhD. If you are severely autistic and can get through this curriculum, by all means, go do it. If anything, I think the U.S. is, at least right now, painfully diverse. We allow so much diversity. I was describing to my girlfriend earlier today. Here's the U.S., right? When you go on a guided tour, and then you got the people that just aren't into the tour at all for whatever reason. They don't want to stand close. They want to ask a question that's already been answered. Some guy's got to take a dump. The people that can't stop. That's America. We're all on this tour together. And we all think we're going for the same reason, and everybody is doing their own thing. That's the benefit of diversity, when you try to solve a problem, but it doesn't help when you have to go in one direction. And so when I think about like what the problems of racism are, I look around at the country. If white people are that bad, then white people are that great because they created a place where you can literally burn the flag in the country. You can't go burn the flag in most other country in the world. You can't stand in front of the police and protest their existence as they protect your right to protest their existence. It's just such a nonsensical thing. Does DiAngelo make any kind of allowance for that at all? I mean, or is it all just, are white people all just garbage?
Well, I think that DiAngelo, the short answer is no, DiAngelo doesn't discuss that. I will say that I think America, and I mean, I would agree that there are positives and negatives to diversity. I wrote a book chapter about them, so I refer people over to Taboo as opposed to, going through a windy 20-minute exegesis on this. But the short version, the advantages of diversity are increased cosmopolitanism, so better, people always say cuisine, but also arts, culture, museums, 100 different things. Opera in its original languages. That's one. I think that's the least important. But also, two, a decrease in groupthink, which is a huge advantage in business. It's one reason we usually beat the Japanese, where everyone at the executive level is an upper middle class Asian male. That's another advantage. Increase in patent rate because people come from different backgrounds. That to me is someone from a business background is a real, not like I like looking at lots of different colored people, but that's a real increase advantage of diversity. The disadvantages are equally obvious. I mean, diversity decreases social trust, although not by as much as we originally thought. It increases conflict. So everyone in political science knows the 3 advantages and the 2 to 3 disadvantages. Whether diversity is good or not really depends on what you mean by diversity. I think having a society with lots of Japanese and South African businessmen that come in and marry and settle down, or artists or whatever, that's great. I mean, if diversity means people from countries that we've traditionally fought multiple wars with that still do not like this country very much, not really singling anyone out, Iraqi Americans that I've met seem to be happy to be here. But that form of diversity hasn't worked too well in the past in a lot of Europe. I mean, diversity could mean rapists and murderers in a prison cell block, and that's clearly not a plus. So it really depends what situation you're talking about. But yeah, that is a problem for large societies. And no, DiAngelo doesn't really touch on much of this, I'd say. Her book is mostly about critiquing white people for being fragile and telling them to be less fragile, which basically breaks down to listen to brown people. I will say, though, I think the questions you've raised are pretty interesting. I mean, obviously, from any objective, logical standpoint, the United States of America is one of the greatest countries in world history. I don't think that's really debatable. I mean, rivals might include the Roman Empire, sure, Russia at its peak, the entire EU. But I mean, one of the most significant nations in terms of feeding people, providing rights, writing the Constitution, all modern democracies use in history. So this is something that's actually awkward for the woke brigade, because at the same time they are arguing that white people are, ruthless, worthless pirates, they are also having to deal with the fact that people from all around the world seem to want to come to these Western societies that are 70+% white, and that we're allowing them to do so, and that they seem very happy to get here. And I've never seen anyone logically resolve this quandary. Like, I've asked it jokingly to people like feminist girlfriends, why are all the people from these beautiful societies that should be noble and free of war and so on, fleeing over here on doors and rafts and so on. And the comment is just like, well, don't be glib. We should let in as many of them as possible, which doesn't resolve the question. But yeah, no, DiAngelo doesn't talk much about that. The focus of the book is this idea of systemic racism and the secondary idea of fragility, which is that because whites are never questioned, because whites are a unified ruling class. And again, all of this, in my opinion, is nonsensical. I mean, 43% of whites went for Mr. Obama. I mean, 52%, I believe, for Mr. Romney. I mean, there are incredible divisions in the white community. But because whites are this unified, unchallenged ruling class, white people are never asked about their race. They're never asked to justify their hairstyles. They're never asked to justify their clothing choices, the way they speak, the things that minorities are asked to deal with. So if white people want to learn how to be anti-racist, she says, they should get through that fragility. They should put themselves in more situations where minorities can harshly criticize them and tell them what is cultural appropriation and explain to them what is racism and so on. And at this point, after mixed panels of whites and blacks defined racism over and over in the hundreds of pages of laws that back up our Civil Rights Act, again, we very often with this additional stuff get into people just flagellating. Like, I don't mean to be profane or anything, but like literally the questions in feminist sociology are like, is it okay for me to give oral sex to my black boyfriend? Like, I'm a woman. Is he dominating me? Or because I'm white and I'm in control, am I dominating him? And like all of these people have really spent a lot of time, and that, I think that was a classroom discussion I was in. I don't know if that's in a book, but that was a real example. And a lot of people have really spent a lot of time thinking about this, how to be absolutely perfect on race. And I don't think being absolutely perfect on race is necessary, but DiAngelo's book is really focused on those people that think that it is. And again, I said this is one of like 6 or 8 books of this kind. I mean, there's Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, Andrew Hacker's Two Nations. So if anyone wants to read some smart woke people, I mean, those are 4 recommendations. But all this stuff, basically, what they do is they break down some gaps and they say these gaps must be due to racism. And then they jump from there to how not to be racist. And I note that this is never done in reverse, by the way. I mean, right now, if you're looking at personal income, black people make about 85% of what whites do. Asians make more. It's like 107%. So, I mean, it would be very easy to pick out those fields that we must be dominating in order to earn that equivalent income and use those as examples of racism. Like, what about the complete African-American control of professional athletics? But nobody ever does that because the point isn't to have a conversation about advantages on one side and then the other. To point out that most of the good blue-collar jobs in the post office are currently dominated by African-Americans in urban areas or something. That's not the point. The point is to say, well, there are still some gaps out there, and this is what whites need to do. If you actually ask someone who says this stuff, you know, what should upper middle class blacks or Asians do? We want to hold up our end of the bargain. First, they'll just stare at you. It's surprised to hear that question. But then they'll say something vague, like, why don't you work on issues within your own community, like sexism or something, and let us handle the white people? So I get the feeling that as long as there's any imperfect white guy out there, there's going to be a market for this kind of stuff. It doesn't matter whether whites are overall making no more than Asians or middle-class blacks. It doesn't matter whether whites are no more racist than Asians or blacks or Arabs. As long as there is something that is imperfect that can be fixed, there's a market for white fragility. Little fat dog.
Yeah, I like fat dog. You know, I always wonder, people talk about utopia. You and I, we've discussed this before, but it's like they don't read or don't have like an understanding of Erasmus and More's conversation. And the fact that the guy who in the story, who tells the story of you know, utopia, his name literally means the purveyor of nonsense. It blows my mind that they don't understand the, you know, the nuances of this very important piece of literature. They just say the word utopia and think it's possible. There's no way it's possible. People, you know, it's a human reality, not an archetype, just a genetic reality that some people are going to outwork their problems and they're going to amass power because they're just going to fucking outdo the next person every single time they meet him. That's how Pete Rose got great at baseball. He just refused to be anything other than great. That's how Bill Gates just outworked people. Donald Trump just outworks people. People hate to hear that, but the man doesn't sleep. He just has 3 work days every day. So it seems like when you have these kind of ideas, you deny anybody the chance to just go out and do what they need to do in terms of solving their own problems.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I mean, first of all, not only does the name, I mean, forgive my law school dog Latin here, but not only does the name of the guy who proposes utopia mean something that translates pretty literally to Dr. Bullshitter.
Yes.
Utopia also means no place. Like it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The implication is impossible place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in general, in athletics, people often say the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Right.
Like if you are focused, for me, I mean, I prefer basketball. My best sport was actually middle distance running. But I mean, if your goal is to run 2 miles in a 5:40 split and you do one at 5:45, you can either nut up and do the second one faster, or you can complain and feel upset because you missed your first mark. And a lot of people do that first thing where missing perfection causes you to actually not become good at something. So the whole idea of whether the utopian goal is even worthwhile is an interesting one. I've talked about it in business. I've talked about it in sports. But one thing that I will say here is that it's also contextual. Like the USA of today, because I'm rambling here a little bit, would be utopia to an ancient Greek. Like those people were great warriors and thinkers and so on. But I mean, people were wiping their butts with their left hand. I mean, the idea that we have clean paper you can use in the bathroom would seem amazing, like something out of Olympus. The idea that you don't have to kill a whale to have clean, effective burning oil. You know, you flick a switch on the wall and, you know, the diesel generator in the basement powers the electric lighting of your house. This would be seen as like the fire in the gods' palaces. So to some extent, we are living in what would have been the utopia of our most honorable ancestors, the Zulus and the samurai and so on. I mean, both those groups of people carried a spear or sword with them everywhere because life was so violent.
Yeah.
Wealth was measured in cows, maybe in wives. I mean, so we've come a very long way from any of these societies. And I mentioned 3 very high performing societies.
Yeah.
But it's never good enough. What you find is that as you move through the solution of a problem that has always plagued humankind, 1, the solution tends to create new problems. And 2, people start to become aware of problems that they had never even previously thought of or known to exist. But I mean, an example of the first thing, like now that we've pretty much solved hunger, at least in the first world, we have a problem with obesity. 1 in 2 people is extremely fat to the point where it affects functioning in sport or war or business. I mean, people are dying years early because their organs are overloaded with fat. So we thought that when we solved the problem of hunger, we'd be 1 step closer toward nirvana. But it turns out we're not. Humans are gluttonous eaters like dogs and most other predators. So if we have enough food, we'll just keep eating it, and then we'll die from having too much food. So you can't solve these things. The 2 options are literally starvation and morbid obesity for at least 30-40% of the population. That's very unfortunate. It depressed me when I read that in an economics book. But I mean, a second element of today's life is that we're creating new problems. So in the 1960s, great leaders like Kennedy and King, and they deserve that title, looked at what were the traditional problems of humankind. JFK describes doing this, actually. And, you know, racism, that's a conflict. Conflict with the Jews or abuse of the Jews. Anti-Semitism, that's an issue. Protestant-Catholic conflict, that's an issue. And they sat down and wrote laws that were designed to resolve these problems, and that largely did. You don't see a lot of Protestant-Catholic war today. But in this newer, more tolerant climate, 10% of the population that declared they were gay. You saw Stonewall happen several years after this occurred. So there's now another group that feels oppressed and isolated, the LGBT community, that was completely in the shadows during the period when blacks and whites and Protestants and Catholics were fighting, but that had a civil rights movement of its own within my lifetime.
Yeah.
And now that gay people, just you're gay, you like dudes, okay, now that they mostly have rights, we're seeing the trans community come forward and say, well, no, this isn't just some weird obsession we had as teens. We want to live as the other sex throughout our entire life. And now there's that civil rights struggle going on. And there are actually some very legitimate questions about that one. Like, should biological males ever be allowed to compete athletically as women? So there's never going to be a point, and when that's resolved, when we decide, okay, 75% of the time, yes, or whatever the decision is, there's going to be another group that will come forward. I think vegans are going to have their moment. People are going to start noticing what we're doing in these factory farms. But you're also seeing all kinds of weird, excuse the language, sick shit. Like the MAP movement, I mean, minor attracted persons. I thought that was a joke on Reddit, but it's not. I mean, people are now saying, well, I'm a pedophile. And as long as I'm using virtual imagery or the kids are 14 or whatever, what's your problem with that? And I mean, my problem is that it's disgusting based on my training as a middle-class Westerner. But I mean, they're citing the ancient Greeks and so on. So I mean, you could see that as a movement. There's never going to be a period when every group feels entirely satisfied. And again, with the trans rights movement, we see there's a direct clash there with the feminists. So like second wave hardcore feminists, like the people we think of as feminists, their whole thing was there's nothing you can classify as just female and thus weak. Like if I want to throw a heater, remember those ads like Virginia Slims and women's softball? Like if I want to throw a heater 97 miles an hour over the plate while I'm chewing tobacco, I'm not a man, I'm just a bad girl. Like the idea was that gender stereotyping is BS, and I kind of agree with the feminists on this. But now there are people coming forward and saying, well, okay, technically I'm a male, but because I perform my society's gender stereotypes so well, treat me as a woman. There's no common ground between those two groups, although they don't seem to have fully realized it yet. So yeah, you're never going to find perfect peace.
You know, yeah, the modern feminist, you know, would hate the Virginia Slim ad, you know, like you've come a long way, baby. Like, no, we haven't. They would get mad at themselves in the past. I love it. And you also, like, I can't say, hey, I'm 100% on your side. I love people. You know, I'm a feminist. I'm for black people. I'm for Asians. I'm for people. I get thrown out of that group all the time. No, you're not. No, you're not. You know, it's like, you're not even allow me to be an open person. And it's a shame that, that book inspires that kind of belief that, you know, somehow people are bad and they're assigned some kind of political lean, some kind of ism that's negative. I mean, even like nationalism doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's okay to be proud of where you're from and want your country to succeed, you know, before somebody else's. Like that can be all right, but we don't like that. We'd rather we are the emo teenager of the world in terms of the prime nations. We hate ourselves. We cut ourselves. You know, like,
well, in a sense, that's because we've become, I mean, like emo teens all come from rich families. Like thinking back to dating and just going to punk and hip hop shows, like you never meet someone with like self-harm behaviors and a room plastered with pictures of alternative bands and, you know, like her own skateboard and so on, that's living in a trailer and has to work at Jewel 40 hours a week, at least in my experience. So it is the luxury of time that allows us, not that the emo kid in that analogy wouldn't have real problems, and not that we don't, but it's the luxury of not having to fight for food that allows us to spend time thinking about all this bullshit. Like, one of the most astonishing findings that I came across researching Taboo was that there are more civil rights marches today than there were in the 1960s. And that kind of sums up how I feel about the modern left. And like everything I say, this is checkable. Go to Ella Frame, quote unquote, the data resource website. There were, I believe, 3,286 BLM marches so far. And that's a few more than the classic, like the 3,000 long walks that sometimes called that took place during the 60s, at least taking that at its face value as a number. I mean, so let's say there are as many. Racism's declined 95%. I mean, that's an insane statistic. We are spending more time protesting residual racism today than we spent protesting racism in the 50s. I actually asked my buddy's dad, who's a black preacher, why he thought that was, and he said, well, back in the day, we had jobs. And it's a funny one-sentence line, but yeah, you're a middle-class black man in the 60s running a butcher shop in your community or something. You can't just put the meat down for a week and go walk to D.C. and march around with a sign. But I mean, now today, because there is such a large welfare class among all races, because there are so many students, because there are so many paid activists, we are the country that has the ability, we're probably the only country that has the wealth plus the laws that would allow this to occur. For either the far left stuff or any of the right wing stuff, if you tried this in Germany, the Polizei would be breaking heads with Uzi butts. It'd be over in an hour.
Yes.
I mean, so we have that tradition of free speech. We're very rich. We have nuts on right and left. And that's why we have such a passionate climate of discourse, if you will. And to me, a lot of it's a worthless waste of time. I mean, how do you change the government? You go vote, run for office. I mean, we know what's actually worked. Give money. Like, it's interesting now that I'm reasonably well off. I could see any politician up to maybe Senate within a week just by writing him a check and calling and making an appointment.
Right.
So, like, I would have no problem lobbying a politician to do something. But I would view that as a more effective way of doing it. And most taxpayers could do this. It'd be like $500. I view that as a more effective way of doing it than loading up a boot with dog crap and throwing it through his window. Like, I don't really think the second has any impact. There's something to be said for kids learning how to fight, practicing against off-duty soldiers and, making out at the rally and so on. I view activism to a certain extent as healthy, but I'm not sure how productive that stuff is.
If you want to find out about the brutality of police, be a little tipsy with your friends in a car in Germany, and the driver not drunk at all. And when the Polizei says, get out of the car, in English, knowing that we are Americans, and one of your friends says, no, watch how long it takes for that stick to hit him in the face.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you understand that no was not the right answer. And you get the fuck out of the car and you do what you're told. And we don't have that here.
Well, a lot of this, one thing that I will say, and I don't think this is an inherent side effect of diversity. I mean, I think in the North in the 70s, a black West Indian cop would have beaten up a black guy or a white guy, Polizei style. But I mean, I think that to some extent, a lot of that is the backlash of woke white people trying to be sympathetic to diversity.
Yeah.
So in the 1960s, something that you saw was the relaxation of a ton of standards under this guise of we're going to help black people, forgetting that we're slightly overrepresented, but the majority of, for example, troublemakers in school or criminals or whatever are white or Hispanic. But everyone kind of got a break because of that. Like, the reason the cops hesitate to kick people's asses in the USA is that there's the chance it would become a racial case. If it was a white guy, there's a chance it would become a civil rights or class or disability case. The lawyers would flock like vultures. As a result of this, there's less police contact with potential criminals. And I'm sure there's some beatings that are avoided that should have been avoided, but there's also a much higher rate of crime in the USA than in Germany and most other countries. And this is just true across the board. Like, I mean, the SAT, for example, is considered to be unfair in race and class terms by a lot of people. I'm not one of them. I don't think it's especially hard to get the SAT test prep guide at the library, prep for the test, get over an 1100. I did this going to school in the hood and then go to college. That's all you need to do to go to a solid state university. You can do it. I tend to be an advocate of the you can do it school. You don't have money for, you need $80 worth of school clothes as a male. I mean, stuff's not that expensive. Go work for a week. I mean, there generally is something you can do to solve problems in your own life, and knowing that is the basis of success. But at any rate, I mean, so people think the SAT is biased. We're now seeing the second wave of SAT cancellations, where like the entire Cal State system said, we're not going to require any standardized intelligence test to come to school here. Now, they're not quite as good as the UCal system, but the Cal State system's on par with probably the educational system in Kentucky.
Sure. That's
a huge collegiate system. So for 20 colleges, you can now just go if you have the first year entry fee of, I think, $5,000. It's not evil, but it's pretty stupid. Like, I can't imagine that anyone would think that would be a way to get the best students in. So at any rate, we try to remove things that we think, and this ties back into DiAngelo, right? We try to remove things that produce performance gaps because we think those gaps might be racist, or they might be class-based if we're talking whites, or there might be some new disability we found out about. But the problem is that every system of competition produces a performance gap. That's the point of competition. So you just get sort of a dull communism if you remove everything that produces a gap, because that's everything. If the two options are, one, the test is very, very, very mildly racist, but it tells how well you can do math, or two, we don't use tests at all around here, big homie, I'd rather go to the college with policy number one, because I know the people in the class that I'm paying the $5,000 or $10,000 for can read. I mean, so to a certain extent in America now, because of our wealth and our civil rights policies, we're facing the question of, should we demolish our entire social system so as to be fair to people? And I don't think so. By the way, as read the comment that I see, I think a lot of woke people are just awkward. I think I see that on the screen. I think that a big predictor of liberal policy behavior is probably feeling like an outsider. I thought of myself as a nerd in high school. I wanted to get an education while I was there. Otherwise, I could be hanging out, making out with my girlfriend. I mean, I wanted to learn things. But I mean, I was also an athlete. I mean, I speak a couple languages. I don't think I'm a particularly awkward guy. So I got along in most environments. But I think that a lot of people, like when you think back to like your gay buddy in high school or something like that, without making fun of anyone, someone who's a little overweight that's having some trouble in the dating scene, your first feminist girlfriend, full of that passionate anger after her mom and dad got divorced, Yeah, those are a lot of the people that go into woke political action later in life and that say things like, I know what it's like to feel outside. I mean, I know what it's like to feel outside too, because I was poor. Like, that's the real thing. Like, even if you're a cool, quote unquote, athlete, if you don't have any money, you're not going to go and get food with your friends or something. But I mean, I think that my reaction to that was to get a job. And I'm not saying it's the same thing for everyone. There are people with disabilities. But I mean, if your issue is, well, I don't have money, I mean, and you're spending time at home because you can't go out with your friends because you don't have money, you can go right down to the market and start working. And it's the same thing for a lot of this stuff. Like, for women, it's a little more complicated. But for males, if you're out of shape, go to the gym. Shit, the Army would love to train you. There's a recruiter in every town. You can go run with them every morning. I mean, so to some extent, there are solutions to these things. And I do think people that say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to join the Army. I shouldn't have to. I shouldn't have to make these sort of sacrifices. I just want people to be nice to me. That is the basis of left-wing politics. Now, as you might be able to tell, I actually have some sympathy for that. But again, you have to also keep in mind the practical reality of we shouldn't change all of history because some people don't want to study for their math test.
Right. I took the SAT to get into a Cal State school, and we're almost done here. I took the Cal State, the SAT. I did not study for it. I just had to take it. I didn't know what score I had to get, and I was hungover when I took it. So you got to imagine like the worst possible combinations. I didn't care. I just needed to take it, and I was hungover. And I still managed to score a 10-something with barely even trying to do this. It's not that hard to get, and this is on the old scale, but this is not that hard. You can also, in California, go to a JC and say, I'd like to go to a UC school at the end of my 2 years or my 3 years of junior college, and you will go right to that school. I mean, as long as you fulfill the program, you'll go right into Berkeley, UCLA, UC Irvine, whatever. The path is there. You don't have to get rid of the SATs to do it, which I guess kind of means that you don't need the SATs either. But the people who are smart and who outwork the people who don't are almost always going to whip their ass, regardless of what color they are, what brand of cigarette they smoke, or what they call the thing between their legs, and who they or what they bump their thing between their legs against. You know, it just doesn't matter. You can outwork 95% of the problems that you have in the world.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Now, I mean, and this actually is the reason I lean right personally. Like, I don't disagree. So basically, in a sentence, I would agree that a lot of things like being poor, maybe being black if you're in the South, being from the South, I mean, being female, they're all kind of things that probably do, if we're talking real talk, make your life 10 or even 20% harder, that challenge you more. But I think that the root reality has to be we have systemic roles in place that allow you to overcome that stuff. Like, literally anyone that's reasonably physically fit and doesn't have a felony can join the Army or something second, the Coast Guard.
Sure. Not
criticizing them. The Coasties do good work from what I've heard. But I mean, the civilian conservation corps programs like Job Corps that we still have, you can basically go fight for 4 years or plant trees or whatever and go to college for free. That's an absolute reality. And planting trees, by the way, is an option. I did AFS, which is kind of junior varsity Peace Corps, went to Latin America. Now, that was just a summer, nothing serious. But I mean, you can spend 2 or 3 years at the Peace Corps, get a scholarship to college. That obviously is different from the military. But it's not especially challenging to do this. I mean, if you're in shape and you show up in your gray sweats and black tee at Peace Corps or Army or Coast Guard or whatever recruitment headquarters and say, I'm here to put my ears in, they're going to take you in and have you sign them forms. I mean, it's not going to be very difficult. The same thing if you graduated from high school, you want to be something like a JV coach and stay fit that way while you're going to community college. There's usually a stipend that'll send you there. I do think that the thing with a lot of poor kids is they don't know that stuff.
Right.
So, I mean, I have a mentee right now, a young guy named Monte, and I mean, we've talked about that. Like, we actually went and got him a job. Like, he asked me one day, we were really goofing around playing basketball or something. He was like, I want to work. And I said, well, get work. And he said, well, I don't really know how to do that. I mean, what do you do? I've only had jobs like delivering papers and so on. So I actually drove him over to Walmart and said, okay. And they thought it was cool, like, you know, guy in this dad role. So they brought out the hiring manager, which they normally wouldn't do. And they showed him this is an application and so on. And another guy who happened to be a Caucasian guy, had done that like with his dad. So the two guys went back there. They actually like played ball against each other a year or two ago. They filled out the paperwork and they turned it in. So, I mean, I think that there's and he's got a job there now. Same thing. Like, I mean, I showed him the Army recruiter's office and was like, yeah, before you do this, you got to consider all the BS they're going to feed you. But like, if, you know, community college doesn't work out, there's this option. And by the way, this is the community college. I think a lot of young men don't know that stuff, though.
Yeah.
Like, how do you, and I'd say men in particular, guys tend to be a little bluffer, a little dumber. Like, how do you apply for college? I mean, like, I work at a university, and I've had people who gotten my address online just send me a letter saying, like, I'd like to come to Kentucky State. I'm a student and an athlete. And I'll always respond to these guys and say, like, that's not how you apply to college, son.
Yeah.
Like, what you're going to have to do is go to this website and fill out these 12 pages of forms, have your dad sign or your mom. But I mean, so I do think poor kids don't know that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we abolish the entire system. It means we show poor kids how to fill out the 10-page application. The idea that it's impossible to succeed when all you have to do to join the Army or the other groups I decide or go to community colleges, fill out those forms is not real. So we shouldn't get rid of the collegiate system based on this assumption that it is impossible. And a lot of this also borders on the racist, like the whole thing with, like, can you get an ID to vote? This is my least favorite thing in contemporary society, the idea that it's racist to ask African Americans for voter ID in cities that have massive problems with voter fraud, whether or not every one of those people is caught. I mean, like Detroit politics, you couldn't convince me there's not a fair amount of voter fraud. There are actually people like Avi Horowitz, the documentarian, that have gone to working class Black communities like Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and asked people, like, do you know how to get an ID? And people were so irritated that he almost got in some fights. He's this tough looking, like, urban Jewish dude. He was talking to, Black guys from the same background, a neighborhood across. And people were asking him, like, are you screwing with me, bro? Like, DMV's over there on 125th, but I mean, I feel like you're a little racist. But the point is that it is, in fact, in a different way, racist to not expect Black adults to know how to drive a car or get a state ID. So anyway, I think you can usually get most things done, and I don't favor abandoning social institutions under this because of this talking point that's not true.
Right. Yeah. Well, listen, I've taken you way more than an hour, and everybody should go check out the review of White Fragility at commentarymagazine.com. I also recommend that you get Taboo, because a lot of what we discuss, Will gets into these things, and basically it's taboo, 10 facts you can't talk about. And these are the things that we have to talk about. It's very Lomborgian, or for Lomborg, it's very Reillyan to have these conversations about where should our efforts be? Like, where really are the problems? Is it race? Is it money? Whatever it is. And guys like Will, whether you like him or not, whether you make, allusions about his true Black nature, which I've heard online, which is ridiculous. Here he is right here doing the work, citing his sources, and he's got a license to do this because he's got a damn PhD. He can't make a baby show up, but he can work through the numbers and tell you what it all means. And I always appreciate your time, man, when you come on. It's always enlightening, and I'm excited about the next time we do this. So thanks for coming on. Everybody definitely go support Will's work.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Always love doing these with you. Have a good day, man.